Welcome back to the Co-Opting AI series. We are back for the Spring 21 session with our 20th Co-Opting AI event on security. My name is Mona Sloane. I am a white woman with long brown hair braided into a braid. I wear blue glasses and bright blue earrings. I am a sociologist here at NYU. I very broadly work on inequality and artificial intelligence in the context of design and policy. I'm a fellow with the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. I also work with Julia Stojanovic and Steve Kujan on building NYU's new Center for Responsible AI at NYU Tandon, where I also teach. I have the pleasure of teaching wonderful engineering students in the social sciences. I run the Co-Opting AI series here at IPK. I also co-run the Shift series, and I am the tech editor for Public Books. As I said, this is the 20th Co-Opting AI event, which is kind of a big deal for the team. I'm very pleased that we made it this far, and we have wonderful programming coming up for this year as well. I've had the pleasure of hosting over 60 wonderful speakers over that time, and I'm extremely grateful for the energy and expertise that they all have brought into this space. And I'm also very grateful for the wonderful work of Team IPK, who are making these conversations happen together with me. Jess, Zari, Sam, Arvel, and also our director, Eric Kleinberg. Thank you so much for the ongoing support. Also, a huge thank you to our co-sponsors, without whom this would not be possible. Of course, IPK, but then also the 370J project under the leadership of Elena Toscano, and the Center for Responsible AI at NYU. I want to acknowledge before we get going that I am standing here in Brooklyn on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples, and I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous communities on whose land you are currently standing, and to commit to begin the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Please also join me in thanking all the essential workers in New York, the US, and globally who put their lives at risk to keep us safe in what is still a raging global public health emergency. I also want to express my sincere commitment to the Black Lives Matter movement and the ongoing project to tackle white privilege and systemic racism and to develop anti-racist culture in our communities and institutions. Today, I also want to give a special shout out to the next generation who I have the pleasure of interacting with in the classroom and who is waiting really in the wings for us to bow and step aside so that they can come in and clean up what we have left them with. Their zest for justice is really contagious. And I'm saying this because I'm starting a new semester at NYU and I can't wait to get back to the students. Now, speaking of the future, as we are seeing a shift in the political landscape of this country, I'm very glad that today we are having a conversation about a term that very much fuels a lot of innovation that is happening in and around artificial intelligence, security. If we take a look at the global discourse on artificial intelligence and in fact global AI policies, we realize that narratives, policies, and innovations in AI are often tied up with notions of security. The pandemic and the digital dependencies it continues to increase has thrown into sharp relief how vulnerable our increasingly AI-mediated world is to different forms of cyber threats. At the same time, you must acknowledge that security often serves as a justification for using technologies to scale up and optimize surveillance of already over-policed and oppressed communities. In our conversation tonight, we will examine the links between the topics of algorithmic harm, national security, and cybersecurity, and ask what or who counts as risk or a threat in the context of AI. Now, enough of me. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel tonight, Newton Campbell, Ram, Shankar, Siva, Kumar, and Norén. Starting us off will be Newton Campbell, who is a computer scientist specializing in artificial intelligence. Through SAIC, he currently serves as an artificial intelligence subject matter expert on the NASA Langley Research Center OCIO data science team. There, he leads the development of several programs in urban air mobility, geomagnetism, virtual reality, and high-performance computing for Earth sciences. Prior to NASA, Dr. Campbell spent 10 years doing research and development in support of the US Department of Defense and intelligence communities. In that capacity, he served as the principal investigator and technical lead of multiple cybersecurity and artificial intelligence projects with specific focus on internet privacy and cyber physical systems. Dr. Campbell completed his PhD in computer science at Nova Southeastern University. He regularly coordinates STEM activities with schools and media groups in the Baltimore-Washington metropolitan area. He is an active member of the Planetary Society, the Philosophical Society of Washington, and the IEEE. He is a member of the Schusterman Foundation Reality Network, the Australian American Leadership Dialogue, and the French American Foundation, representing young US technology leaders. Welcome, Newton. Following your remarks, will be Ram Shankar Siva Kumar, who is a data cowboy in Azure Trustworthy ML initiative at Microsoft, focusing on securing ML systems from adversaries. His work has appeared in industry venues like RSA, DEF CON, Bluehead, DerbyCon, MRICon, Infiltrate, and many more, as well as academic venues and workshops at NURBS, ICLR, ICML, IEEE-SP, ACM, CCS, and Harvard Business Review. He is the founder of Security Data Science Colloquium, the only avenue where ML engineers from every major cloud security team congregate. He's also the co-founder of Adversarial ML Threat Matrix, the first industry initiative to secure ML systems. He graduated with 2 separate master's degrees from Carnegie Mellon University and is currently a technical advisory board member at University of Washington. He is also an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. Welcome, Ram. Closing the panelists' presentations will be Laura Norén, who is the Vice President of Privacy and Trust at Obsidian Security, a cybersecurity startup based in Newport Beach, where she runs privacy operations. Norén is a frequent speaker on data ethics, privacy legislation, and the social impact of data-driven technologies. She continues to lecture at universities and publish in academic journals, as well as the popular press. She holds undergraduate degrees from MIT and a PhD from our own NYU, where she completed a Mona Sloane postdoc at the Center for Data Science. A warm welcome to this wonderful panel. Thank you so much for bringing your energy to the space. And Newton, please take it away.
Sure thing. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Mona. And hopefully with all of those credentials, I can get the share screen function to work here. So I'm going to hit share. If not, I'm sure one of my panelists could help us out. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. So let's get right to it. So many of you have seen in the news, and I've seen firsthand, that artificial intelligence can have both negative and positive effects on security. And you can get into a number of discussions on the topic, but allow me to try to set up a way for us to frame this discussion. If we're going to talk about AI as it relates to security, then we have to start by thinking about one very specific question. What do we care about? Because fundamentally, while security in an abstract sense is about being free from dangers and threats, in practice, it's about protecting assets. There's no such thing as an all-encompassing security blanket. So the first step for any organization or individual when talking about security with regard to AI or not is being decisive about what you care about. So if we're discussing artificial intelligence in the context of security, we need to talk about this subject in terms of systems, because that is what AI cares about. And in this context, systems can be broken down into 3 categories. Computer systems, like the ones that you're watching this panel on, physical systems, such as a vehicle, a power grid, or a biomechanical physical system like you, a human being, or your brain, and then social systems, which have been in the news quite a bit lately. From online voter suppression through bots to hacking Wall Street short sellers. And that last set of systems have typically been ripe for the picking because they are typically built on information. And information is the main output of artificial intelligence's most mature subfield, which is machine learning. The growth of machine learning capabilities, particularly over the last 2 decades, force us to have to think about artificial intelligence and how it may impact the system that we care about, whether that system uses artificial intelligence or not. In fact, I'd go as far as to speculate that if every kind of industry hasn't already been touched by AI in some way, then it will be in the next 5 to 10 years. So it now has to be in the discussion. That means that today, AI related goals with respect to security and systems either include directly protecting a system from being exploited through an artificially intelligence based threat, the application of artificial intelligence to an already existing system to add functionality and give the system some kind of nuance or wiggle room such that it doesn't need to be overseen by humans 100% of the time, or the implementation of a system that leverages artificial intelligence for flexibility or as its main functions. Those are our assets. What's interesting about all the different systems listed in this graphic is that, especially lately, it's been the points of intersection in this chart that are where our society gets into trouble. AI is still eluding our world and seeping into hidden verticals across a number of different industries. But the inherent naivete of those industries operating at those intersections are what allows vulnerabilities to easily be exposed and taken advantage of by bad actors, and in some cases, unwitting bad actors. For security, it's important to think about assets. If we go, sorry, wait to skip to that next page. For security, it's important to think about assets in the context of vulnerabilities and the threats that can possibly leverage those vulnerabilities. A threat and a vulnerability are not one and the same. A threat is a person or event that has the potential for impacting an asset in a negative manner. And a vulnerability is that quality of an asset or its environment that allows the threat to be realized. That is the way you get to understand risk. Once we understand that chain for a particular system, we can then really start to think about security for a system. For example, in applications of artificial intelligence where we want to add functionality to a non-AI system, such as augmenting weapons used for national security, potential threats to the AI itself really need to be taken into the conversation. In cases of that magnitude, adversaries may be capable of deliberately introducing the kinds of image classification and other errors that can fool rudimentary AI. Back in 2017, as a matter of fact, a team at MIT successfully tricked an image classifier into thinking that a picture of machine guns was a helicopter without access to the system's training data or algorithm. Very easy to think about how that could be done the other way around. When thinking of the implementation of a system that leverages artificial intelligence for flexibility or as its main function, we have to think about threat vectors that include the data the artificial intelligence uses to the explainability of the algorithm it implements to the application of AI decisions. You have to think about that entire chain. For example, as vehicle technologies advance, the security of data collected by vehicle computers and the protection of onboard systems against intrusions are becoming more prominent concerns. Many of the sensors and automated components providing functions now handled by the driver will generate large amounts of data about the vehicle, its location at precise moments in time, driver behavior, and vehicle performance. The systems that allow vehicles to communicate with each other, with roadside infrastructure, and with manufacturers seeking to update software will also offer portals or vectors for possible unauthorized access to vehicle systems and the data generated by them. And we've already seen examples of each of these things occurring in early autonomous vehicle applications. And so finally, we have to talk about risk. In the context of security, you have to talk about risk. What do you have to lose? Risk is the potential for loss or damage or destruction of an asset as a result of a threat, one of the things that we saw on the last slide, exploiting a vulnerability. And because AI touches and can touch so many things now, so many different assets are at risk. And if you had to ask me, the major security risk when it comes to artificial intelligence at its highest level is a repurposing of the system. Okay? In other words, I build a system with a specific purpose, often a noble intention, and either my AI is exploited or my system is exploited by AI. Unless we learn how to prepare for and avoid the potential risks, AI has the potential to lead to some of the worst events in the history of our civilization. Considering the number and scope of unfathomably horrible events in world history, that's really saying something. And I'm not talking some far-flung future in which the robots have taken over here, by the way. I'm talking about the seemingly eventual growth of what is happening right now. In the case of privacy violations, for example, AI-fueled algorithms can create new bits of sensitive information unbeknownst to affected customers and employees. This means that AI may create personal data. When it does, it's data that has not been provided with consent or even with knowledge that is used by malicious actors. It's exploited by malicious actors, even if you're not the one who explicitly even if it wasn't explicitly included in those terms of agreement. Another example is corporate warfare. We've already seen that Google, Amazon, and other dominant platforms collect real-time data and match that with AI algorithms to generate near perfect market intelligence. What happens when malicious actors with less morals than those companies get their hands on the same kind of AI and enough data? You're talking about corporate wars, people wiping out other folks' jobs, things like that. And there are far many others that I won't name here, but we can get into during the discussion, such as malicious users repurposing systems for their gains using threats like deepfakes, intentional algorithmic bias caused by bad data, intentional open data manipulation by governments that can justify a type of socioeconomic inequality. Believe me, and we've already seen some of it here, but authoritarianism will leverage AI as needed. And then, of course, there's the looming threat of autonomous weapons, which is something that you could have an entirely separate session for here. So, there we go. Darn it, sorry, I went back. Promise I know how to use computers. All right. So, once folks have thought about assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and risks with respect to AI, then what? Well, the approaches that I've seen to security in the domain of artificial intelligence tend to follow one or two standard security paradigms, for better or for worse. And that's passive security or active security. In many cases, in practical implementations, you want to implement both, but you need to study each individually and then study the integration of both in order to really build security around a specific type of system. In the case of passive security, we're usually talking about built-in security. In passive security, you develop an architecture that can be broadly defined as a design feature which deters threats while remaining largely invisible to its users. Take an armed bank robber up here in the top right as an example of a threat. A bank teller is an example of an asset that may be vulnerable during a bank robbery. However, because there is a bulletproof glass that was built to stand between the robber and the teller, it denies the robber the opportunity to shoot the teller. You built in or on security as a part of your infrastructure. The threat remains present, but one of its harmful effects has been mitigated by a built-in protection mechanism, the glass. And when you deploy the glass, you're aware that it can only take so much damage, or in the case that the teller, or in this case, the teller could probably reach over the glass. So it's not foolproof. However, it is enough to deter the casual robber walking by with a gun if you're in the US. Now, in more real world scenarios, this is an open area of research for artificially intelligent and autonomous systems. It's mostly geared towards safety, but in the case of most systems, if you don't understand how to operate safely, you definitely won't understand how to operate securely. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is attempting to address that problem right now. Back in 2018, they started what's called the Assured Autonomy program. The program is developing mathematically verifiable approaches and tools that can be applied to different types and applications of data-driven ML algorithms in these systems to enhance their autonomy and assure they are achieving an acceptable level of safety. In short, they're trying to define assurance cases for autonomous systems, land, air, and sea. And one of the best examples that they demonstrated regarding this was of the mechanical brake wire for a dumb system, effectively, a simple system. We used to be able to guarantee assurance for a mechanical brake wire. You measure its length, you measure its width, you measure its density. We can tell you how much stress it can take. We can give you a number. We can assign a number to safety assurance. How do you do that with a neural network or some other complex data structure that's running the vehicle and is vital to the vehicle? That's one thing that DARPA is actively researching right now, and I've seen some brilliant demos of that program. Another built-in approach has to do with ethics when developing or interacting with AI. An ethics framework essentially gets all the right people thinking about ways that the system can be misused. The United States intelligence community, in fact, released version 1 over here on the right of their ethics framework. And I thought it was an absolutely wonderful template for other groups to use when developing systems that may be influenced by AI or is an AI in and of itself. So passive security at its peak would implement what we call zero trust security. And that's something we're actually also exploring at NASA. At NASA, the associate CIO recently stated that the agency is working to apply zero trust principles through emerging technologies and partnerships with the Department of Defense. So lots of avenues for passive security. Adversarial security is the other side of the coin, and it's a little less explored and always a little bit more expensive. The idea here is that you take a more active role in defense, you acknowledge your threats, and you take a set of actions to mitigate the threats at all times, sometimes even following the threats. In the case of our bank teller, she used the mandatory martial arts training required by the bank to detect that the bank robber was about to pull a gun, flipped over the bulletproof glass while kicking the gun out of his hand, and took chase. You don't always have to take chase, but actively dealing with the threat is the idea behind adversarial security. And I'll finish with one last example from the DARPA Radix program, Rapid Attack Detection, Isolation, and Characterization Systems program. It's a program I helped DARPA to start and served as a principal investigator on back in late 2015 up until I want to say early 2017 was when I left for NASA. But they both acknowledge AI adversaries and use AI to continue serving the US's most vital assets in the event of a large-scale attack on the electric grid. The idea there is to detect the attack, cut off the most vital assets, hospitals, schools, anything that's the military bases, things that are critical to U.S. infrastructure during the attack. So cutting those things off from the attack, and then forensic analysis and actually dealing with the attack. But that is, again, a very active method of dealing with security in that respect. Other active methods usually are just focused on handling viruses directly and things like that. But I thought this was a good way of sort of getting the conversation started, thinking about passive and active mechanisms for AI and building in security. So looking forward to the talk.
Thank you so much, Newton. I learned so much, and I will surely be using this in class. Ram, please take it away for us.
Yeah, that's a really tough act to follow. Thank you, Newton, for kind of like laying the groundwork and kind of like expanding here. And really thank you, Dr. Sloane, for creating this wonderful space. It's very apparent why you're already in your 20th iteration. I'm very honored to be among the esteemed colleagues here, and I'm excited for today's discussion. And in lieu of slides, I prepared a brief set of remarks, and I dedicate this provocation to Dr. Timnit Gebru, whose unjustified ousting and constant gaslighting has hopefully provoked the AI community with a spirit of like righteous action. And these remarks build on top of the work that I've been doing with Kendra Albert, Jonathan Penny, and Bruce Schneier at Berkman Klein Center. And if there's anything you take away from my provocation, let it be that in addition to the security properties, adversarial machine learning attacks and defenses have political dimensions. And I want to kind of like lay out who are the actors kind of like involved in securing AI systems. Now, adversarial machine learning has kind of existed as an academic field, and it dates back to the early 2004. One of the canonical example is Daniel Dowd kind of like evading spam filters. And there's a wonderful paper by Batista Biggio called Wild Patterns that traces kind of like the history of the field. And it's kind of really weird to talk about the history of a field, which is only like 2004. But if you fast forward to present day, the field has exploded. It's pretty much inescapable to attend an academic conference like NeurIPS or ICLR without encountering adversarial ML scholarship. And in the last 6 years alone, adversarial researchers have written more than 2,000 papers on how to attack AI system and how to defend against these sort of attacks. And you can actually see this number like explode in real time, almost. If you visit like Nicholas Carlini's website, he's like a big researcher in Google Brain. So that's kind of the first actor. The second one is like adversarial ML is really having a moment right now in the software industry. Google, Microsoft, IBM have signaled, separate from their commitment to securing their traditional software systems, initiatives to secure their ML systems. So we've got like the industry also now putting a foot in there. And thirdly, it's very apparent that securing AI systems, like how Newton pointed out, is now a national security issue. And countries are racing ahead to secure and safeguard their AI crown jewels. And every national AI strategy that has been released so far kind of emphasizes the need for like safe, secure, and robust AI system. The EU is the furthest ahead with an entire checklist on trustworthy AI. The UK government recently kind of like mandated its Standards Institute to put together a framework to secure AI systems. And in the United States, it's quite an interesting journey. The National Defense Authorization Act, and if that kind of like sounds a little familiar, this is the one that our former president tried to veto unsuccessfully. Finally kind of put some serious money of like $5.4 billion behind securing AI systems. And it's very interesting to read the statement of intent from the drafters. It's pretty unequivocal. And I'm going to quote from that bill. It says, the conferees further believe that such harmful AI systems may include high-risk systems that lack sufficient robustness to prevent adversarial attacks. Now, this is very interesting. It doesn't really say, like, prevent adversarial attacks from whom, like robust against whom, or like harmful to whom. And there's already like this underlying assumption that to an ML system, like an attacker motivated by legitimate human rights and civil liberties concern, and an attacker motivated to hide something from the system are the same. And the Kendra Albert kind of like very pointedly and succinctly puts this, like a facial recognition system really cannot tell if a person wearing a mask is a protester or a bank robber. And this kind of like from this assumption emerges, like, for me, two big pillars of tension that I want to kind of like tease out very briefly. So firstly, researchers must really anticipate desirable attacks on ML systems. For instance, the adversarial examples attack that confuses Tesla's autopilot technology to swerve onto the wrong lane also powers the Equal AI's project for allowing individuals to make a certain image less likely to be detectable as a face. So you really want to think about how it's not just like harmful to, in one context, can be used for a societal benefit on the other side. And let me also give you another example of a membership inference attack. So this is an attack on an AI system wherein you can use to determine whether or not a given data record was part of a model's training set or not. So this could like potentially lead to a lot of privacy violations. So hardening against membership inference could prevent a researcher from determining whether a given person was included, which can be useful for efforts at machine learning accountability or determining the source of images for data set training. And if you look back at the canonical like paper on membership inference attack, it's by Frederiksen, published in 2015. They actually used their inference technique to determine whether a given picture was present in a facial recognition database. And this could also have like a beneficial angle to it, like determining whether a given image is present could kind of help an individual determine whether they're able to bring a court case against a given facial recognition provider. So that's like the first thing that I want to kind of like tease out. The second thing is that there is an explicit arms race that is afoot. So BGO and Rowley kind of remarked that securing ML systems is an arms race, with the attackers trying to attempt to break into the system and the defenders attempting to build robust defenses. And I want to kind of play how this could affect the experience of citizenship, again, using like FRT as a background. I really did like the poster that, you could see the camera, and I really got inspired by that. So if you assume that let's assume there's like an oppressive government regime that's employing FRT as a surveillance tool. You don't have to think super hard for this. So one way is that dissidents may counter by like wearing face masks to evade the system. Now, in order to defend against these attackers who are compromising the integrity of the FRT system, the state may respond by using a pre-trained model with full frontal faces to remove these sort of occlusions. Now, the dissidents may counter again, and this time they might wear like adversarial clothing, like the invisibility cloak work that comes from Goldstein's lab at University of Maryland. Now, the surveillance state could counter again. They could completely bypass faces and use other biometric technologies such as iris scanning or gait recognition to identify people. Now, what I'm trying to get at is like this example is speculative, and it might also be like super far-fetched, like protesters wearing like adversarial eyeglasses. That's not going to happen, anytime soon. But the point of my example is that the way in which standard security arms race thinking can potentially lead to deployment of more draconian surveillance measures that kind of like can suppress dissent. So we really want to think about that. So, so far I've kind of like outlined two ways the politics of ML systems at play, the need for beneficial attacks on ML systems, and how the adversarial arms race could lead to the development and deployment of more invasive forms of surveillance. Now, if you've already not been disappointed by this talk, here's like your big cue. I do not have any solutions to kind of offer here. There's simple things that we as practitioners can start doing. We can proactively ask questions about how the products that are being deployed, whether there are adequate safeguards in place to ensure that human rights are preserved in creation, sale, and use. And here's the final thing that I wanted to kind of leave with. Adversarial machine learning is not the only security technology with consequences for human rights. It's not even the first. But adversarial machine learning is at a very pivotal moment. As these systems become more widely deployed, something that Newton kind of like elucidated in his provocation, theoretical attacks and defenses rooted in academic literature is going to become the stuff of people's lives. And the adversarial ML community and community like this has the opportunity to learn from SDS, anthropology, and critical race theory, and to be really conversation with protesters and others who seek to attack systems for socially beneficial reasons. Now, through understanding lived experience of resistance and applying the lessons from other disciplines, as well as reflecting on the work of those seeking to prevent similar outcomes with, say, spyware, the adversarial ML community cannot just understand its work as political, but actually take affirmative steps to ensure that it's used for primarily good purposes. So with that, I yield back my remaining time. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ram, for this amazing remarks. And I love how this sort of Fallout Newton's sort of setting the scene. Thank you so much for that. Laura, please take it away and close the presentation session.
Okay, let me see if I can get the share screens thing to work. Maybe, maybe not. My privacy settings have prohibited that. Well, that's okay. I will present as just words. I didn't have that many images in it. So I'm a former academic and I now work at a cybersecurity company. So I do security all day, every day, but my role is in privacy. So I usually describe myself as a tech ethicist. And I just work, I work in tech. I'm in a venture-backed company. So that's kind of my everyday, but I was trained as an ethnographer. So my approach to this was to really think about how I can tell a story about what I do that leads to a provocation. So I'll start with the provocation and then I'll tell the story about how I got there. So what I work on is trying to fight for privacy in the world of security. And what I'm worried about is that, especially as AI becomes more used in security, and I think right now it's not used very much because it's a very hard problem, but as it becomes more and more used, I wonder if we run into a situation where security and privacy become a zero-sum game. This is obviously a problem for my career. But let me tell you how I got there. So I'll just do a little bit of quick mapping of what I think we're talking about when we talk about privacy. I've given other talks where I argue that we really should stop talking about privacy as the main vector for protecting data because it's really impoverished. Nevertheless, it is how a lot of the laws are written. And so this is kind of what that means in practice. Like, what does it mean to do privacy operations? It's what I do every day. If we're following the GDPR, which is probably one of the better pieces of privacy legislation out there, we're responsible for mapping data. So this is sort of like the journalist version. Where did you get this data? Where is it coming from? Where is it now? When did it get here? When are you going to delete it? What is it? Is it sensitive? Who has access to it? Why do we have it? A legitimate reason for having this stuff. How did it get here and how much is it? So this is a sort of who, what, when, where, why. That's really, really time consuming when you're working with a lot of data. So lots of time and effort is spent in trying to figure out those questions. There's also a privacy principle that we should probably try to be transparent with data, which the way that works is usually people have the right to know right away. So privacy policy, and it should kind of explain what it is that's happening with all this data. So at least that's what transparency looks like in this. There is an idea that we should have data minimization policies and practices in place. This is somewhat new for the data world. When I first started in data science, data hoarding was definitely very popular and very well supported. It turned out to have some negative consequences. So at least if you're kind of at the leading edge of companies that follow the GDPR, you actually try to minimize what you get. So you take only the necessaries. That probably still leaves a lot of gray area to determine what in fact is necessary, but at least the idea that you shouldn't just take it all and store it forever. moving in the right direction. And then we get down to the things that I care about the most, because I think this is really what's at stake when we talk about privacy, whether it's data privacy or any other kind of privacy. It's about consent and control. It's really about power. That's what we talk about when we talk about privacy. And for reasons that I won't get into, we've decided to call it privacy, which is really makes it hard to have the right conversation. But anyways, that's where we've gotten to. So when it comes to consent and control, what that actually looks like is the right to delete, maybe the right to correct your data record. If you live in California, the right not to avoid having your data sold. Although interesting parallel to prostitution. So we sort of punish the people who sell it, but we don't punish the people who buy it, which leaves a large loophole. If you wish to bring up that interesting metaphor in the conversation, I'm happy to get into it. You might have the right to get lawyers involved. This is the US. We're really into that. The Europeans have gotten into that too. And in some ways, there's some notion that maybe we should start distributing control to data subjects as a more general, like those rights to delete, to get lawyers involved, et cetera, give some control to data subjects. So that's kind of what privacy ops look like. Mostly you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what we have, where we got it from, when we need to delete it. And there's some effort to try to make this all transparent and minimally harmful. I care about that a lot. In the world of security, I would say there's a lot of overlap here between what a privacy person does and what a security person does on a day-to-day basis. We all like encryption. We should definitely encrypt things. That's generally pretty protective from a security perspective and a privacy perspective. The security people also kind of like it when you delete certain things, because it's less for them to have to try to protect. So maybe just as a matter of practicality, they're okay with that. And so there's a lot of overlap. But because probably most people, with the exception of my esteemed panelists, don't sit around and think about security all the time, I'll tell you what it really looks like from the ground. So what you mostly hear in the news as the big stories, like there's a nation state espionage attack or some really sophisticated attack. Recently, we've been talking about solar winds and sunburst. That's really sophisticated. Quite frankly, a lot of people in security don't quite call it an attack. It's sort of espionage that got discovered. Those things get a lot of attention. They're super sophisticated, and probably that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about using AI in security, because they're so damn sophisticated. They're really hard to detect, and it would be very difficult to use AI to do that right now. So to Ram's point about the Defense Act being like, well, this stuff may not be very robust. When I heard that, I was like, yeah, that's kind of an admission that AI in security, for a lot of security use cases, it just doesn't work. The threat vectors are so novel and so sophisticated, it's difficult to throw an AI at them and get anything out of it that you can make any sense of. But so that's one thing, and yes, we care about that, but there's a whole range of more everyday problems in security where we would see AI used because it's a better, or at least, let me back up a little bit. Many security companies seem to claim that they're using AI. It's somewhat dubious whether or not they actually are. So to some degree, we're having this conversation at the right time because a lot of the use cases are very underdeveloped right now. So maybe we can steer them in a better direction. But anyways, what are those use cases? Well, they're sort of like the street crime of cyber, of the internet, of the interwebs. So this is like your typical run-of-the-mill hacker or fraudster. They're out to make a buck, just like any other criminal for the most part. So they're going to try to get, basically reroute some sort of financial transaction into their bank account. There's 1,001 different flavors of how to do that, but that's kind of what they're after. Then there are this is all still a very human situation. So then there are the big oops, or like lazy people didn't do things the way they should have. Like, man, I'm really gonna install that security patch because if I did, it's got these dependents and I don't want to deal with it, so I'm just not gonna do it. That happens, that causes a lot of problems in security. And then there are insider threats. Those employees, they do the darndest things. And those are situations that, I mean, to err as humans, so we can at least somewhat predict what types of things people might do or not do that are going to cause a lot of vulnerability. Hackers and fraudsters are also sort of in the realm of being predictable enough, but not perfectly predictable, that AI might help you detect a security problem in action, or find some hygiene issue that needs to be cleared up. Those kinds of applications of AI and security might actually work. We're still not at the stage where we can really deploy AI to discover these massive nation state threats. I mean, if anyone knows better, please correct me, but I haven't seen anything that indicates that is the case. However, what is the case is that we're very worried about nation state espionage, potential warfare, as well we should be. And this is where I start to get concerned about the kind of crash course that privacy and security are on. In order to, so let's say we admit that we live in a world where we probably aren't going to be able to stop the use of AI in security. I don't think that's possible, and I'm not even sure it would be wise, or would be a social good to do that. So if this is going to proliferate, if AI insecurity will proliferate, how do we balance against the idea that in order to have really um, capable AI against the most sophisticated threats, we need to surveil ever more, whether it's ever more data subjects, ever more data about them. We need more data, deeper data. This sort of starts to go against almost all the principles. We no longer really have data minimization because this is probably not going to be effective in this use case. We're going to probably start to reduce that transparency that we like, the right to know right away. Well, you're probably not going to tell someone, hey, world, this is how we think we're going to wage our national security research and development. Like, that's just not going to happen. That's because you're telling your adversaries at the same time you're running the program. So that's not going to happen. Data mapping kind of goes along with that transparency piece. You could probably still do it, but for whom and why would you be doing it if you're never going to be called to the carpet to be transparent about it? It's very time consuming and difficult. So probably that falls off the table too. And the idea that someone would be able to consent, opt in and opt out, I don't see that being realistic either. And I do also have concerns along the lines that Newton had concerns about centralizing the control of these apparati within the government, which is probably likely, or within large corporate actors that can use them for a variety of purposes, that may also not lead to an overall social good or improvement in the kind of collective status of society. So that's kind of where I am. My provocation is: do we run into a world where the things that right now are moving so in tandem, like the security team and the privacy team, would both like to have this data mapping done, on the one hand to protect it, on the other hand to sort of, you know, actually do data minimization in practice, actually do privacy by design. These are not just principles for me. This is something I do every day. But I am concerned that security and privacy at some point do become a zero-sum game in the digital age. And I'm not sure that any of the legislative approaches to this problem have really taken that into account very seriously. It's actually, this is not a new conversation. Privacy and security are often brought into this kind of theoretical academic discussion. How do we achieve both? And this is not new. This is just sort of the newest instantiation of this very difficult tension between privacy and security. And I just kind of wonder if privacy is going to at some point be co-opted in the name of security. And what does that look like? I don't have answers to that, but we've seen this happen before, and it usually means marginalized populations get more heavily surveilled. People who are in power manage to find ways to consolidate that power and use it for their purposes, which are not, in fact, all encompassing or particularly interested in equitable distribution. So I will leave it there, and I really want to thank Dr. Sloane and also copy her, although maybe not great timing, but I appreciate the invitation to sort of give credit to the people who lived in this place before my ancestors did, which is a little complicated here because it wasn't just one tribe, but it was at one point the Metawankiton Dakota, and before that the Ojibwe, which are still present in this area. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for this wonderful provocation that connected very beautifully with the other two provocations that we've heard today, and is a wonderful opener for a conversation. And so we're going to have about 10, 15, 20 minutes panel conversation. We already are collecting questions from the audience. Attendees, please drop your questions in the Q&A or on social media where we'd be collecting those. I get sort of chair's privilege and get to ask the first sort of set of questions. And my first question is for Newton, and it sort of is about something that I heard come through all three provocations, which is sort of the looming question of, you know, defining the threat. How do we define threat? We've talked about AI being the target of attacks. We've heard about AI being the protector in some ways. Sort of both of these are sort of, you know, all about defining the target or the threat. So there is something here around the complexity of that definition. And so I would love to hear from you, just from your work, how you think about that and how it comes across your desk.
So, you know, this is, you know, it's interesting to ask that in the context of my work, because my work typically tends to be fairly goal oriented. We have a specific, back in the DoD in IC days, it was, we have a specific thing that we're trying to do. We know what that thing is. And we have ways of measuring, you know, and you know, triaging and characterizing the threat. So what you do is, you know, you attempt to think about your goals, right? What do you have in mind for the system that you're trying to implement? And again, when I say system, I don't just mean computer system. I mean a system. It could be an activity. It could be a way of conducting specific operations, things like that. Those are all systems that can either leverage AI for its benefits and for security, which I've certainly seen it do, or systems that can, you know, that may not even use AI for the most part, but can be manipulated because those systems take inputs. It's important to remember when talking about security that you're never going to be 100% secure. There's no such thing as a 100% secure system. A 100% secure system is maybe a computer thrown in a safe, and that safe thrown to the bottom of the sea, and you know, but it has no functionality whatsoever. So really, you have to get really good about being decisive, having leadership that's decisive within your organization, and can lay out, here are the specific things that we need done. If you can do that, then you can start to enact a security posture that takes into account the most likely threats, the most impactful threat, and the most impactful threats, which are in some cases two different things. Sometimes smaller threats, someone might get a little bit of information about you. Someone might, you know, figure out what kind of operating system that you run on, or that you run on. That can be a threat down the line, sure, but how impactful is that right now? So identifying the threats, laying out risk models for some of these larger systems is basically the way to go about it, and not just doing it one time. You know, security has to be an active part of any program that you're running in the government, and it has to be an active part of any program that you're running privately. It shouldn't just be sort of a thing that's off to the side. It needs to be built into your system. The example that I showed earlier about the DARPA Assured Autonomy program, they're building safety into those systems, but the algorithms, the way that they're measuring things, all of that can be used to think about how do we build security into the system as well. Because once you do that, you have a system that can, by and large, run safe enough, and then you can at least come up with discrete definitions of what the threats actually are. I hope that wasn't too high level and abstract, but I was trying to capture things that can happen across multiple industries.
Can I just like poke you a little bit more on that? And then I'm gonna, okay, so what's just really literally from your desk, what's a threat, or what's something that emerged as a threat in the context of your work that you never thought, where you were like, how did that happen? How did that happen? How's that a threat?
I'm thinking of things that I can say.
Yeah.
So in the realm of internet privacy, I've certainly seen in that space things like going to different web pages and a lot of the web analytics being pulled off of those pages. A lot of people might not want that private data to go out about them, because it then starts to leak things about potentially who you are. And if you're in a place where who you are might make you dangerous to who's in charge, that's that specific function of the website pushing out that information over open networks is a threat. Okay, that fundamentally is a threat, and attached with certain bad actors who could leverage that information and a potentially unencrypted network, depending on what country you're in, that makes it even more of a threat.
Okay, thank you for that example. I'm gonna take that cue, Newton, of who you whether you're dangerous or not depends on who is in charge. And I'm gonna sort of link that to a sort of emerging conversation that becomes more and more important in the fact community, the fairness, accountability, and transparency community in machine learning, and sort of the socio-technical crowd, as it were, which is around risk modeling and impact. And so, Ram, I would be really curious, against the backdrop of your thinking and your provocation, and also obviously your work, we talk about impact assessment as a or increasingly talk about that as a way to mitigate risk for precisely those communities who have been who are over surveilled and are oppressed. And so the risk assessment and impact assessment comes from a very different place. It comes from protecting assets. And so I wonder if you could give me your thoughts on how you see this sort of those moving closer together in your work and your thinking, and against the backdrop of obviously the critical thinking that you're doing. And then I have a second question, but which I'll ask to Laura.
I mean, that's a very tough question for me to like. But I've clearly captured like the key tension, and I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be able to do justice, by answering it in a minute or so. I can tell you this, right? Like, if I just look at the adversarial ML researchers, that the community that I'm part of, I'm part of the adversarial ML research community. Our constant framing is, let's protect ML systems from attacks. Let's try to make it robust. Let's try to make it reliable. Let's make it safe. And then, I love the work that the fact community, puts on the table. And, we are trying to make things more transparent, or trying to make it more accountable. And there's this inherent tension. And Hema Lakkaraju from Harvard has done fantastic work on this, trying to tease out when you give something away in terms of like explainability, bringing the, shining, like cracking open this black box, you're also having to account for attackers like slipping in through these crevices. So it comes back to like I'm just like trying to reframe like your positioning. It's very much like aligned a little bit to what Laura said, like, in her provocation about like this privacy and security being like a zero-sum game. It's almost like like impact and kind of like this is also becoming increasingly a zero-sum game. So, I did not, as a CS researcher, I did not encounter the politics, do artifacts have politics until like 3 years ago, until like the amazing Kendra Albert showed it to me. And I was like, blown away. So it really does, I always keep thinking about now, like how this artifact of like securing ML systems seem to like advantage a few and disadvantage the others. And that framing is now increasingly taking space in my mind. So again, sorry I don't have like, like an answer to your question, but I definitely do think this framing helps me.
Thank you so much, Ron. I'm going to toss that right over to Laura, because I'm sure you have thoughts on risk and sort of that sort of emerging, newly emerging theme as well.
Can you just restate the question one more time so I know that I'm at least attempting to answer the right one?
Of course. So I'm interested in, risk framing and impact assessment. And as Ram has just kind of alluded to, that also being, as you stated in your provocation, potentially becoming a zero-sum game, whereby, we kind of have to learn how to hold the tension between, those intending to work, those assessments working as intended, but also bringing new sort of issues, possibly new exacerbation of inequities and so on. And so I wonder how you think about that in your work. And the key word here is risk modeling and impact assessment.
Well, I do. Earlier today I was filling out an impact assessment, so I do this all the time. I will say this, and I maybe I'm doing this on such a everyday basic level. This isn't what you really mean, but this is like, what does this look like on the ground? For the most part, most people right now are doing it the way that I'm doing it. And so we're asked to assess the risk of something. You don't really get style points for being creative, coming up with all possible risks, but there is some valor in thoughtfulness. But I would say that I'm humble enough to realize that whatever I can come up with during an impact assessment, someone else who's even more motivated than I am, or more specific, more narrowly focused on some particular motivation that I may not share, will come up with whatever risk or vulnerability and will exploit it. So do I feel like that's the weakness of the zero-sum game, is that you're sort of showing your hand? No, I don't. I mean, it probably kind of feels like that sometimes, but I guess I would say that I am a pretty firm believer in, the more eyes you have, the shallower the problem. So I think that there is enough good in this world and enough people who are on sort of, at least generally speaking, the same team that we're all on, that we're looking for more equitable distribution of benefits, and hopefully just less distribution of harms. But if they're going to be harms, then they should also be evenly distributed. And just in going through that exercise is net positive. So I don't, at least in that, in terms of like, does assessing risk make you more vulnerable? No, I think it probably makes you less vulnerable, which is the intention. So maybe I'm too much of a positivist there, but that's where I stand on that. Do I think that it always moves the needle like meaningfully in the right direction? Is framing the problem as a risk problem always the right framing? No, it's not. But that is what we do. So maybe that's where you were going. And I would say, yeah, I'm not always convinced that that's the right way to move forward. But in doing so, do we make ourselves more vulnerable? I don't think so. But I would happily be disagreed with. So the rest of the panel or you or the audience disagrees with that, I would love to hear that, unpacks a little bit.
Yeah. And I invite the panelists, of course, to ask questions to one another and drop wisdom and comments as well. If you have any on this, now's the time. Otherwise, I would move over to the questions that have been coming in. Okay, let's do that. Newton, I question for you from Nabil Ahmed. What are examples of effective safeguards against the deployment of AI or ML by malicious actors?
Okay. I mean, usually it's custom, right? So, and this is the overall issue that Laura was getting to, which is malicious actors are creative. And however you do security, unless you have a specific adversary in mind, it's never going to be all encompassing. One of the things that I talked about earlier is there's no such thing as an all encompassing security blanket, something that is going to protect you 100% of the time. So in reality, what you have to do is, and I thought Laura put this really well when she talked about, how can you distribute the impacts, because we've thought about that for systems in the past, right? If you can define your assets well enough, then you can start to say, all right, here, if this thing gets attacked, here is how I can spread out the effect from actually causing any real harm in this space. If, for instance, the power grid, thinking about cyber physical systems, the power grid gets attacked, or if a company gets a denial of service, right? That's what having load balancers can actually help you with, and having security mechanisms on load balancers. Usually distributing the attack out is helpful, but once again, it really takes active thought, and this is what makes security so hard. I think, if you're asking me, one of the biggest reasons security is so hard is because it's expensive. It's hard to think about all of this stuff, right? The US government has massive amounts of funds, particularly geared towards its military, and they still have trouble with it, right? So, there is no overall one and all solution. I think that, and when someone first discussed this with me, I said, well, this is, it's kind of too high level to actually be practical, but actually having a framework for how you implement and deploy your assets. And I'm using assets once again more in that term, whether it's some sort of social network that you have, if it's an actual system, if it's something physical, but having a framework for constantly reviewing the things that are going on in and around that system, constantly thinking about the threats through, from requirements all the way to testing and maintenance. Understanding and redefining those objectives, and making sure that all of that is informed by the latest science and technology is really all you have to do. So, that it's an expensive endeavor, and really we've defined so many different sort of security frameworks for handling different kinds of threats. It's really now about knowing, all right, what is what is the thing that is threatening me, and and then taking steps against the threats that could potentially have the most impact, that have the most risk on your system, right? I've dealt with some very unique threats. Some threats natural, some intended, some unintended. I'm thinking about a natural threat in the form of solar flares that could have wiped out our satellite infrastructure, and for which we had to start taking steps using the U.S. power grid to mitigate some of those threats. Again, that is a system that security is now being thought of and has been thought of for the last 20 years, and you keep designing new frameworks to deal with it. But when a new threat like that is discovered, which it was by NASA back in 2012, you find the appropriate stakeholders, you find the right people, and you get into each of their processes. You embed that new threat and thoughts about that new threat into their processes. It's, again, very high level, but each attack is custom. And that's kind of the problem right now. You can knock out the low hanging fruit, the Metasploit, the script kiddies, all of that. But when it comes to custom attacks, that's really where things where you need to start having custom thoughts about your security.
And there's such a long tail of those custom problems.
Yep.
That's not new. That's just still hard.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Newton, for that. It seems really that definition is kind of the ongoing problem. It appears.
One thing that and I don't mean to take up too much time. One thing that one of the directors of IT told me, like, this is of the Department of Defense, like he's deputy director of IT, I believe. He said this at a conference to me, and I'll never forget it. He said, in the Department of Defense, particularly when it comes to IT, but otherwise as well, no one's innovative. No one is innovative. They're decisive. They make decisions. They decide the framework that they're operating around. They decide here are the set of paths that we can go down as a team. And in this case, we're talking about security. Here are the set of paths that we can go down when designing something with respect to security as a team. You weigh the risks of each of those paths, and then you execute. And then you as a team need to take in mind all of these different security frameworks and potential threats, and make sure that you're tracking what each of the assets are. But the point is, be decisive if you're implementing anything that may touch AI or that is involved with AI.
Thank you for that, Newton. Really appreciate it. I have my next question for Ram, and that's a longer one. Emmanuel Moss is asking, given the stakes of the potential harms that can arise through AI technologies that the panelists have presented, as well as the way security practices discussed so far seem to place the onus for securing against these harms on those who produce these technologies, what role might government regulators, third-party inspections, and the broader public play in this discussion? Who is or should be accountable for lapses in security within the context of AI?
Ooh. That's a great question. And I think, and I love Laura and Newton to also jump in and add their thing. I can give you my view, and I come from, again, securing ML systems perspective. Right now, it's the wild, wild west. Your toaster has been through more safety ratings than the algorithm controlling your finances. And which is scary, but also is is pretty interesting. And depends on who you ask and what your thinking is. The previous CTO of the White House said that we are going to take a very hands-off approach for ML accountability. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, it's not his exact quote. But is that the right way? If my house burns down because my Roomba inserted electrical mop into an electrical outlet, who needs to be like held accountable? You know, the manufacturer of Roomba, like, or the person who built the ML system, or the open source like library on which the ML system was built on. It is complicated. And I think we do not have an answer yet. But I'd love to kind of like understand, Laura, you've been like doing this from the security and privacy world, and you specifically mentioned legislative action. How are things on that side of the world?
Well, I appreciate that you got asked like the super hard question and I was laughing. That wasn't thrown to me. So nicely done. I mean, one of the things I like about the GDPR is that it's not particularly overly prescriptive. It says you must have a privacy by design policy, and then it is, you know, it's your job to figure out how to match that to your organization. Now, of course, I happen to come at this, you know, as a self-proclaimed tech ethicist, so that I'm going to approach that openness differently than someone who's trying to do as little as possible. So, you know, that, and so from my perspective, where I kind of tend to think that ethics are more useful than, say, regulations, I like the flexibility and openness of the GDPR, but playing devil's advocate, well, if you give people a lot of terrain to play in, they're probably going to find, you know, the dankest corner and hang out there. So that's, you know, I think there's plenty of evidence to support that. I do think that there's a role for regulators to step in. I think it's optimistic to think that regulation would ever appear particularly quickly. It's always been reactionary. That's true of whatever you're trying to regulate. You kind of have to figure out how this is going to go wrong, and then you might get a rule that can prevent that kind of thing. Like, we can pretty much imagine that our toaster might burn down our house somehow. But could we also think that actually if you eat a lot of burnt toast over your lifetime, you might be more likely to get cancer, and maybe the toaster should be measured, you know, measured against that criteria too. It should not be allowed to burn your toast, which I would like for other reasons. But you're never going to get particularly forward-thinking regulation just by design of what it is and how it works and how long it takes to get it to pass. This one is a particularly complicated world. ML and AI as applied, that really is not something that most people fully understand. Even people who do it pretty well still admit that there's kind of a transparency problem, and that's going to be very difficult to get rid of. So the idea that sort of the general public could easily be encouraged to participate meaningfully in this would, you know, I think that should happen, but I think it's a hard problem. I don't, you know, it requires a lot of education. I've worked in education, and I understand that, you know, having certain kind of conversations with even undergraduates, they have already kind of been moved into their areas of expertise and their ways of looking at the world, their habitus. So even getting a different way of thinking into them at that point is hard. So I'm not sure where we would need to be starting our interventions, but somewhere before undergraduate, if we're expecting really good, robust, like liberally thought, but technically savvy input into this problem. I don't exactly know where that's going to happen, but you know, the most robust conversations have both of those elements, like really robust liberal thinking about like all the possible different ways this could play out, with some technical savvy to understand, well, what is and isn't possible. When you talk about bias, what are you really talking about at the technical level? So that's why this is a particularly, you know, wild west, because there's very few people who are sort of competent and interested in thinking on all these different levels. Yeah. I'm glad we're having this conversation here, but yeah, Newton, just like non-past.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a couple of observations there. One, based on Laura's discussion of the subject matter, we have to decide who is faster to educate the general populace or Congress and regulators, and I honestly don't know. which side of that is faster to educate. I think that it's funny, from all of these talks, as soon as policy gets brought into the discussion, education is always the first thing to be brought up. But for some reason, in the actual regulators room, it's never the first thing. So one, I think that we could and that we should invest more in terms of things like the Consumer Protections Bureau, revamping the FDA, revamping a number of different agencies to give them to give them the tools that they need to actually do regulation. Many of the people there don't have the skills or the tools that they need to actually execute regulations appropriately. The second, in terms of attribution, one of the things that I often see as I'm dealing with a number of different problems in AI, and there are a number of different ways that people take on AI, but we often ask for anything in this domain. We often ask for solutions to problems in this domain that we've never solved with any other technology prior to this. Attribution in terms of other forms of technologies, it's just not it's not a solved problem. We have some concrete examples, sure, just a few concrete examples, but if you were to actually draw that curve, I wouldn't actually know what the shape of that curve would be. So it's a much more broad question than we think it is, because we're thinking of just sort of the general context of artificial intelligence, but we also just have not solved that problem from either an ethics standpoint. There are ethical views of it and discrete ethical views of it, but we also haven't solved that problem from an ethics standpoint, or even developed a trend in terms of a regulatory standpoint. And I don't see us doing that, unfortunately, anytime soon. But one thing I have argued for is more AI, not just education, but AI experts working alongside regulators, potentially even sub-agencies with experts to actually help out regulators to help address this problem over time. And that I think for me, that's the one lane that I see that we can use to actually attack this problem, because education is going to take a long time.
Thank you so much. I loved how you guys passed on the ball. Well played, everybody. I want to move us on because we have 3 more questions, 2 of which sort of go together, which I really want to sort of get in before we close. So Bogdana Rakova is asking, what are the risk dimensions you usually look at? We talked about risk, but there's a second element to this question. How is trust defined and measured regarding individual risk dimensions of security with regards to AI models? And Ram, I'm going to pass that on to you. And then you can throw the ball, but be mindful of time.
Yeah, sure. It took Congress legislatively to define explainable AI in 2021. And trustworthy is like a combination of fairness, accountability, security. We're not going to get like a decisive definition anytime soon. I don't think it's needed. So for me, trustworthy AI is to kind of like ensure guarantees, whatever that guarantee is. So that's how I think of like trust, is like I'm able to ensure guarantees. And that's why my group's name is Azure Trustworthy Machine Learning System. We want to be able to offer guarantees to whatever those set guarantees are. And Laura, I'm also very curious, how does trust play in your locale? As you're kind of like thinking about privacy and security.
Oh, well, I mean, I have to say, as a small startup, we're constantly having to earn trust.
Yeah.
None of us, I mean, we're playing in kind of what I would say is a little bit of an idealized playing field where all of our potential customers are at least as sophisticated, if not more sophisticated than we are. So they can ask us all sorts of things. They have the capacity to take the time to investigate what we do at some length before they share data. And then they are also sophisticated enough to know more than we say. I mean, we try to be as explanatory as possible, but they don't necessarily need the education that we were just talking about in the previous conversation. So I think like sometimes it's nice to start with like, well, what does this even look like in an ideal world, so we can remind ourselves of maybe what the goal would be. So if you've got a sophisticated actor who has a lot of options, they have choices in which vendors to use. So then for us, establishing trust is sort of, we'll answer any question they have, we'll demonstrate what we do, all of those kinds of things. It's a really basic conversation, but with something as big as trust, I think it's really important to just touch back to, what does that look like in practice? And I will say, almost none of our conversations ever have anything related to equity involved in them. We protect enterprises, so we're mostly protecting employees, which I do think we should be talking more about employee data, but so far we mostly talk about consumer data because hello, this is America, or the US, and we are capitalists, so we think about consumers first. Workers not so much. But yeah, I mean, for us, we do a lot of, a lot of talking, a lot of sharing, a lot of exposing, the nuts and bolts of how we do and what we do. That's what trust probably, it takes time. It's a relationship. All of these things that we know from living in the world are still true. And in this case, it also takes a lot of sharing of the actual mechanics of how this works. And that isn't that time, but it's also expertise required. So for some of these other kinds of things where you're trying to establish some bar for trustworthiness, if we recall that this is in fact a relationship, it matters who's on the other side, and it matters what their capacity is for understanding harms. If you're talking to this group, we're really good at scoping out like how do you even elucidate what the harms might be and then measure them and make sure they're not disproportionately impacting some groups and not others. We're good at that. Not all entities are good at that, and some entities are very good at that, but then less good at understanding technically what to look for if they would like to measure that. So it's hard, and I would be really interested in having a longer conversation about how you would come up with a framework and the right kind of parties on both sides of that, or on all sides of that if it's a stakeholder thing, to work that out at scale efficiently in ways that work for everyone.
Okay, I'm mindful of time. I want to squeeze in this last longer question, and I'm inviting all three of you to, it's a long one, so all three of you, but short, short answers. And it's about data ownership. So Nabil Ahmed is asking, what are the security implications of the notion of personal data ownership and the idea that people should be able to sell their personal data? And then Sophie Housley is asking a related question. She's asking, what are the panelists' thoughts on data sovereignty in light of ownership of personal data that can be sold? Could this result in greater inequality or equity, given those people in communities of lower socioeconomic status might be more inclined to sell their personal data and have less privacy, and by proxy become more open and vulnerable to some security threats? Newton.
Sure.
You go first.
Sure, and I'll try to keep it brief. So the difficult part about answering these questions with a field that is not very mature is most of the time the answer is it depends. In terms of data sovereignty, I have operated on the internet, from the days of the web, the earlier days of the web, in the 90s. So my take has always been, I don't own my data. that's kind of always been the take. That has evolved over time. But my mentality ever since I got a Facebook in 2004 has been, this is something sitting on someone else's servers and they're letting me use it. We need to come up with a definition of what is your data, because I don't think that has been well defined. I think there's been attempts at defining that, and I think everyone has very strong opinions about what those things are, but I don't think we have a good definition of what is, where's the line between your data and Mark Zuckerberg's data, or where's the line between your data and Jack Dorsey's data. Until that's really a question again for our regulators to get a better understanding and then base a decision off of something, and we don't know what that something is. You can identify precedents for coming down to a decision either way, but we actually don't have an understanding of what that is. So right now it's just decided on case by case basis. Other folks?
Rob, do you want to jump in? Thank you, Newton.
I'm going to take this opportunity to highlight the work of two Black researchers who I absolutely love. One is Sabelo Mlambi, and the other one is Adiba Birhane. This is a very interesting question, and I would love for this conversation to be more nuanced, but look them up. They've thought a lot about what does data ownership mean, in a socio technical concept. And I think it's really worth thinking about what is ownership and what is and how it can be traced back to colonialist thinking. So it might not be the answer that you're looking for, but it's definitely something that'll get your mind thinking about.
I was going to say roughly the same thing, although not with a citation. So thank you for doing that. But I think that it is very easy for most people who have been raised in capitalist societies to think that maybe ownership will get us out of some of these difficulties. And to some degree, we should give ourselves credit. Yeah, we have a ton of laws that protect property rights. So of course we would think that this is, well, hey, there's this whole apparatus that protects me. But I feel like that's probably not the way we want to go with these thoughts, because right now we're at a moment. The reason this moment is so special is because we now have data records about individuals that are more nuanced, can last for longer, can cheaply be reproduced, that do things to personhood that we've never lived through that before. Like, my personhood in data is going to outlive me by far and be more nuanced than I can even contemplate in my own little human brain. So that requires a rethinking of what kinds of apparatus we want to protect that and to take guardianship of it. And I'm not sure that the property rights conversation is going to get us there. It's as a knee jerk, I would assume it gets us to where capitalism mostly gets us, which is corporations have a lot of power. People in power manage to maintain that, and people without.
Thank you so much, Laura. And Ron, we had a request to asking you to put the citations in the chat that the attendees can see. That would be wonderful.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Which brings me to the end of this event, the sort of realization that there's a lot of tension that we have to hold. There are no easy answers to tough questions, but that's kind of also the beauty of it. At least as an educator, I can say that in the classroom and in the conversation that I'm fortunate enough to have with experts like you, that we get to try to wrap our head around these thorny questions. Thank you so much, Newton Campbell, Laura Norén, and Ram Shiva for coming. I really appreciate your time and your insight. We're going to stop the recording right here and officially close the event. But before that, I'm going to say we have our next Co-opting AI event on games, which will feature Kishana Gray and Bo Ruberg. I'm very excited about that. And it will happen on the 23rd of February at 6 p.m. So we're going to start an hour later to accommodate teaching obligations. You're all welcome. I'd love to see you back in this space. Thank you so much for joining Co-opting AI tonight. Good night. And that's it. Thank you.